Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the February session of our Native Voices in STEM series. We'd like to start off with our land acknowledgement. And again, this is just a statement. Again, we want to reinforce that we go beyond these words. So we respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona on the land and territories of the Indigenous people. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and Indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. The Native Voices in STEM seminar series is co-sponsored by the Indigenous Resilience Center, the University of Arizona Sloan Indigenous Graduate Partnership, and the Water Resource Research Center, the Native Youth Alliance, and the Office of Societal Impact. The seminar highlights Native scientists, engineers, educators, leaders, and social activists. It offers students an opportunity to network and learn about the research and careers Native leaders with Native leaders in various fields. And today we'd like to introduce Dr. Johnson. Dr. Johnson is a member of the Hopi Tribe in Northern Arizona. Dr. Johnson holds a Ph.D. in Natural Resources from the University of Arizona, a Master of Public Policy from Pepperdine University, and a B.S. in Agriculture from Cornell University. Dr. Johnson is a faculty member and assistant specialist with the School of Natural Resources and the Environment. His primary work is with the Indigenous Resilience Center. Michael is also a co-author in the Indigenous Chapter in the Nation Climate Assessment 5. His newest initiative is called the Revitalization of the American Indian Food System, based on the stewardship of principles of indigenous conservation. Most recently, he continues to practice Hopi dry farming and a practice of his people for millennia. So we'd like to introduce Dr. Michael Johnson.
Thank you, everybody. I know a lot of this is, about, it's kind of my career path on how I got here. So I kind of wanted to start a little bit off that before I jump right into my presentation, because my presentation is kind of my career path and how I went from graduating Winslow High School way back in the day until where I got my Ph.D. in 2019 and stand before you today. And so it's been kind of a rocky road for me at times and stuff like that with my own personal challenges, but as a result of my hard work and a lot of great people helping me along the way, I'm able to stand in front of you today. And so a lot of what I like to focus on is just this concept of Indigenous ingenuity. That's to bring recognition to our people and move us away from the concept of victimhood to one of resilience. And so I kind of wanted to start with that. And so my topic is going to take us through a number of topics and establish why I do what I do today. So first of all, I want to say something about the Indigenous Resiliency Center. We focus on the nexus of food, water, and energy, which my work does touch, and a lot of our people who work for the Indigenous Resiliency Center are also doing this type of work. But right now we're trying to build a climate hub that would cater to not only tribes in the Southwest, but possibly throughout the nation. And so this would be the first of its kind in this realm, and so I'm really proud to be a part of this effort. So why are we here? So this is the most important thing. During my recent work, I found this quotation by the IPCC. They're a global organization who looks at biodiversity across the globe, and they say that Indigenous peoples now protect 80% of global biodiversity on a mere 25% of the planet's land, with less than 5% of the population. So why is that important, and why is that? Why do Indigenous people control or steward 80% of global biodiversity now, and what happened to the rest of it? So right now, along with those biodiversity, is also what I call in high plant species and biodiversity. In those same areas, there's always a high language richness. That means that those areas that are diverse in plant and plant species and wildlife species always have a high language richness. Now that's important, and that's important for one of the main reasons that I'm going to be talking about. It's the relationship that exists between Indigenous people and the land that they foster. First of all, I want to also look at tribal food insecurity. This is here in the United States. You can see this map that shows a lot of the areas that are basically do not have tribal food, that do not have that are insecure with food. We call them deserts, food deserts, and so I kind of wanted to put this map out there because you can see the most highest points of this tribal fight insecurity is on the reservations. So current climate solutions are short-term and problematic, and so being a climate person and also a scientist, I want to explain why these climate solutions that are being advertised today and put out there by crop scientists, why I feel like they're short-term and problematic, and kind of go into my own solutions and address some of the barriers that I find in there. First of all, scientifically derived environmental solutions are too narrowly based. That means that they're just only for the short term, basically, and they're not really focused on the long term. And I can make that by just looking at our crop modeling models that are out there. And still, nature is still approached from a point of commodification. There's really no relationship that exists, but it's really a point from the point of commodification, and that leads to a myriad of problems. And also the market system drivers, based upon quantity and efficiency, counter what I would call nature-based solutions, because quantity and efficiency is one of the biggest problems of why we're facing the climate we are right now, because of all the different environmental inputs, or not environmental inputs, but things like pesticides, herbicides, that leads agriculture to be at least the #1 or #2 polluter in the globe. So these Western crop models are too narrowly focused, and what I'm talking about is that we only have 6 or 7 crops that are constantly looked at to try to increase the yields and things like that, and to try to figure out ways that we can continue on this process of trying to feed what they call 1 billion people, when in fact, 70% of the globe is dependent upon only 1 to 5 acre farms. A lot of these crops take up way more than that, and a lot of them kind of erode their environment because they require such a big land base and more land, because the pesticides and herbicides that are being applicated aren't really good for the soils. And this is called the regenerative movement, and this is what I'm trying to move towards. And so right now they only offer 2 solutions. They only offer cover crops and no-till to deal with a myriad of problems that I think needs to be solved, and we need to find other solutions to that. So what I'm talking about crop and genetic biodiversity being the key to help mitigate climate change, as far as also continue to feed these billion people that we're always talking about. The crop and genetic biodiversity is the key. For without true biodiversity, we have no true sustainability. So imagine that if you had a crop that was, for example, a hybrid crop or a monocrop, if you had one disease on that crop, it could wipe out the whole entire crop. But if you have genetic variants within that crop, some of those crops will be wiped out and some of them won't. So you'll always give your chance to success in the long run. So this crop biodiversification has started to take a hold on this. Indigenous people have been, diversifying this crop since the get-go. Not only the crops have they been harvesting have not only been grown in the wild, but they've also domesticated in a way where we have, like at Hopi, we have something like 17 different varieties of maize, which is incredible. And so right now there was this recent article that came out that says a revolutionary way to feed the world that's very old. And what they're talking about, like in Africa, they're talking about bringing back some of these more traditional crops that were able to stand up to things like heat stress, water stress, and things like that, because these crops have been adapting in these places for thousands of years, and there's a reason why they were grown there. Well, they weren't put there, but they actually grew there over time. So, and also dependent upon the biodiversity is that a lot of people don't know that half of our global gross domestic products relies upon nature and biodiversity. So that's half of what people are making, generating money, is dependent upon biodiversity, which indigenous people now sit upon 80% of. So how come indigenous people are still looked at as what I would call global north, global south? And I'll try to help them find that, and what I would think would be better terms to use, in first world and developing nations and stuff like that. Why is it like that? So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about COP. I was one of the fortunate ones to go to COP28. Conference of the Peoples, and I was looking at that, and some of my takeaways were immediate. I think corporations, in my mind, are still in very control of what governs and what's trying to battle climate. Corporations are still in control in a lot of ways. They're able to make these decisions. Indigenous people, in my mind, just by being there, because we're not nation states and we're territories, we still have no voice when it comes to mitigating climate change. And so, like I said, indigenous people are still looking for a voice. And so part of my work is trying to bring back that from a recognition standpoint of view, to give people that voice that they would need. So indigenous domestic seeds, this is a big part of my work. This is part of my grant that I'm working on. And it's not just seeds from my own community, but it's seeds from other communities. And I'm really working on this and try to figure out, like, what is the importance about indigenous domesticated seeds. First of all, the importance of this is that they're all place-based. Most seeds that indigenous people have used and most people that crops that indigenous people have been using since time immemorial are very place-based. That means they're suited to grow perfectly in that environment that they're from. And so that's what I mean by the importance of biodiversity is there. The importance of these seeds are there. But the problem that I see right now, and part of this I'll talk about, is who has the rights to these seeds? You know, who controls the genetic material to come up with a new short corn variety like they have at Bayer? Where did that genetic material come from? And how are we supposed to help mitigate that? So the descendant communities of these seeds have a chance to also benefit from what's being discovered out there. So GMO seeds versus Hopi seeds, I kind of wanted to do a visual look at this. You can see the vitality of these Hopi seeds planted in the same conditions, same soils, but you can see how much better they look than their typical GMO seeds. I really don't know why that is, but when we plant seeds at home, we plant them in clusters. And I always like to say, you know, you're always welcoming your neighbor in your house, and therefore, you know, you work better as a community than you would as an individual. And so that's kind of what I want to show, just the vitality of these Hopi seeds, given the same conditions against the GMO seeds, or what they call hybrid seeds now, across the United States. So also these crops are very drought tolerant. For example, at Hopi, our crops are very drought tolerant. This picture was taken in July. You can see how cracked the soil was, but you can look at the plant and how it's thriving right now. This is a typical maize plant. We typical plant in this fashion for a number of reasons, but it does help with things like heat stress. It helps conserve soil moisture. It does a number of things, which is very important. But these drought tolerant crops are becoming increasingly valuable because of the way our climate's moving right now. So it's also very important to protect the genetic material that comes through these crops. So like I said, the descendant communities may also benefit from these crops. So tribal data sovereignty for indigenous seeds. This is another part of my thing. So how can we make sure that the data sovereignty that we need is kept within the tribal communities where it's from? You know, right now there's the CARE principles out there, which everybody seems to be talking about, called collective benefit, authority, control this data, the responsibility we have to those communities, and also the ethics that are involved. These are CARE principles. They're very philosophical in nature, and so we're trying to find mechanisms to enact these further so that we're able to help those descendant communities also benefit from any research or potential research that would be done. So right now, what I'm looking at, you know, everything is focused on, especially intellectual property, especially here with the Native American Game Repatriation Act, we're looking at solely cultural items. Cultural items basically are designed to specifically fit their individual communities on a whole. But what I'm looking at is I want to approach this because this is agriculture. I want to look at a territorial approach. For example, maize, for example, that comes from down south. There were a lot of communities down there who were growing maize at the time. And up here in South America, specifically with the Pueblo tribes and other tribes across the United States, I'm looking at how do we protect this by territory, not necessarily individual tribal governments or tribal people. See, like I said, indigenous crops are often grown in specific regions. Indigenous crops have been transported across regions and shared. So there'd be another thing to try to protect just the single community aspect. Some agriculture is grown in the wild and therefore is not patentable under our current intellectual property rights regime. And the nutritional benefits of these crops has been poorly documented, and data sovereignty is very problematic. So we're trying to work on that by doing a nutritional benefit analysis, because you need to do a nutritional benefit analysis on indigenous crops if you want to get them into the schools to fill native youth, because that's what we're missing right now. Some of the reservations that we have about a 60 to 70% diabetic rate. In fact, statistics will show that every American Indian child that's born today has about a 50% chance of getting diabetes. And so we need to really work on that. So the rematriation of seeds, rematriation is a beautiful word. It's bringing back the sacred to the earth, often governed by women. And so, but also we cannot just talk about the rematriation of seeds alone. We also need to talk about the resources we need to support these efforts, because the resources is vital. So what I'm talking about is setting up things like grow out regions. I'm also talking about seed banks. Some of the stuff the United States Department of Agriculture is buying into and supporting more, but we need those resources, and we need those resources most specifically, not for tribal governments, but for those grassroots indigenous food organizations who during the time of COVID and every time else was always getting food to their people in numbers in here. And so they're the most impactful in my mind when it comes to supporting their people and taking care of their people from when their child's born to the time that they leave this earth. They're very impactful, these native-led food organizations. And so what can we learn from Indigenous society? So what can we learn? So I'm going to give you some examples from our own society. First of all, this example of Hopi agriculture and a lot of stuff that I can comes directly from these books produced by the Hopi Culture Preservation Office. Footprints of Hopi history has a DNA analysis in there, which is very important. One of the elders said, well, we need to do this because the corn, if we take care of the corn, it will take care of us. You know, the Hopi people was also documented by Stewart, who is now the head of the Cultural Preservation Office. He's done time and time again to take photographs on there. So none of the stuff that I'm putting up here is new. And this Becoming Hopi is basically a good book, but it talks about our migration routes. Stuff that I told was very sacred at one time, but it's broadcast in this book, also put together by the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office. And so all the materials that I use when I talk about this Hopi are from these examples and other examples that have already been published. So first of all, Indigenous resilience is based on relationships, values, and cultural belief systems. Now, this is the petroglyph at Old Arrivee. It's also talked about in a number of books, more specifically, the Hopi Survival Kit by H.T. Molly. And so what this is showing to me, and this is how I was explained to it by my grandfather, from a third nation standpoint of view, at least what my grandfather told me. And so what this is looking at is you'll see a square here right in the middle. That's representing this world right now, the fourth world. And so we have two paths that go across. You'll see a bunch of people holding hands on top, and you'll see that staircase-like figure at the top, and that represents what I would call modernity. It's going to be some of the problems and challenges that we face today. It's going to be talking about new technology, all the stuff that we're going to be tempted to go and embrace. And at the bottom, you'll see a person who's planting a stick right there with his corn, you know, going through his field, and you see his line goes directly off that chart. And so what that's saying is that if we hold fast to our traditions, because a long time ago we were designed to be farmers, or we were given a planting stick, or we were given seed, and we were given water in order to survive in the place that we call home, and the place that we steward, in order to continue on our traditions. And so what this is saying is that as long as we're able to continue on our traditions, as long as we believe in ourselves, as long as we put faith in everything that we do, we'll continue on to move forward into the next world. And so the thing that makes this thing unique is that line that connects the two pathways. That tells us that we're in this time where we still have a choice to kind of hold on to our values and to our systems in order to go into that next world when it does come about us. And so this is very important when I talk about relationships, values, and cultural belief systems. So this relationship with nature, to sum this up in some way, you know, I kind of want to show what I'm talking about when I talk about the relationship with nature. When I was building my house at Hopi above my grandfather's fields, I was building it at sandstone. At the same time, there was a little bird building his nest, his home out of sandstone. And it took me just a little while to sit there and ponder that and figuring out who was teaching who. It was a beautiful thing. And so that's what I'm talking about, this relationship with nature. It's taking the time to look at the things that we have, and it's taking time to help come up with some sort of understanding that we are not alone, and that we're here to decide to help each other, no matter if you're an animal or human being. We're just trying to redefine that relationship a little bit better. And so this environmental relationships leads to state stability and continuity. So we've been farming out there for over 3,000 years. You know, you would think that a lot of people ask me questions like, you know, how do you judge your soil fertility? You know, how do you know that your pH levels are fine? You know, why don't you add a cover crop? Why don't you add other types of crops to make sure your soils are okay? But our management system fits our environment. You know, since 1915 to 2015, they're not the same field, but they're the same type of plants. Look at the management system hasn't changed. That's just a snapshot. If I were to go back 3,000 years ago, I guarantee it would look something very similar. But this works perfect in our environment. It's adapted to fit our environment. So what am I saying? I'm saying that Hopi is just one of the few places that I know where corn is raised to fit the environment, and the environment not manipulated to fit the corn. What I mean by manipulated is that even across the Midwest and other areas where they do grow corn, they're always having to add all these soil additives like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, trying to amend their soils using all kinds of compost and stuff like that. And they're trying to make the environment work. Whereas in our way of doing things, we let the environment teach us as a teacher here, and we just work within that environmental context and what it allows to give us. So also these indigenous place techniques are very, very, very place-based. For example, when I talk about, new soils and stuff like that, if I look at the picture that's kind of in the middle on the left-hand side, or maybe your right-hand side, that has new soil, that's just off of one runoff event. And then what that soil does brings all new nutrients, all new minerals, all new things into the soil, and so that plant is happy. So the end product would be a nice nutrient dense crop, like a corn ear that is full of nutrients and dense, almost 10 times more than the stuff you're buying at some of the supermarkets as far as sweet corns and other type of corn. And that's something that I'm trying to show the benefits of. There are other techniques in there that are also involved in our process, but they're all designed, most of them are all designed to conserve soil moisture, because we raise corn in a very limited fashion where we only receive 6 to 10 inches of annual rainfall a year. And that isn't much, because when I was at Cornell, they told me I needed 33 inches of rainfall a year, and I kind of laughed about that because I thought their corn was weak. And so that's how I justified that. And so some of the examples of food security, referring back to that map that I showed at the beginning, this is an example of indigenous ingenuity. This is one of our things that we do at Hopi with our typical sweet corn varieties, is we roast them, in these pits, underground pits, and there's a process to that. But then after it's harvested, they're hung to dry. And because they're not waterlogged, which you would have sweet corn in the store, which is, I've had this corn 4 years later. I took it out of my grandpa's basement one time, and I was gonna throw it away, and my aunt came over and said, "What are you doing? We'll have that for supper." And she just boiled it right back up, soaked it in water for about half the day, and blew right back up to where it was. So that's real food security, 40 years of food security just by using one method like this. And that's what I'm talking about indigenous ingenuity. And so the benefits of these farming practices, first of all, it helps reduce obesity. I talked about that. It reinforces family culture, it stabilizes families, so nobody goes community, nobody goes hungry, environmentally friendly, it increases the concept of sharing, and you learn to have a real respect for the land and what it provides. Notice in all these benefits, I did not put economics. That is the furthest out from my mind. What I'm really focusing on is helping our community and other communities like that, and able to build healthy lifestyles and able to have that next generation grow up, but to make people aware of that, what we're doing is very important for our society. It's building up community, it's not taking it apart. And so redefining Western associated contracts. So as a PhD, that I give myself the leeway to kind of redefine some of the languages that's out there, and I'm kind of proud of that. So one of the first ones I want to look at is regenerative agriculture. And this is what I'm talking about, having to twist the narrative a little bit. Regenerative agriculture, as you see, is in a standard definition by Randy in 2019, is basically just kind of a sterile definition of that. Only talks about soils, health of animals, farmers, workers, communities. That's what it's about. Regenerative agriculture is about soils. But for us, if they want to give us credit for that, I wanted to come up with a new definition, kind of tailoring off that, but being more indigenous specific. So I added words in this, like these management schemes adapted for survival, which are supported by culture, belief systems, and community, which have been incorporated over millennia. And I guarantee, and I can almost make this argument, that that statement that I just read is the reason why indigenous people have 80% biodiversity on their limited land. Because of that, because they have the discipline by having the culture, belief system, the community that brings them that to not extract from the environment without giving something back. That is the key to why we have this 80% biodiversity, and we're stewards of that. So also some of the things that I also like to talk about is this whole concept of evaluation. It seems to me like when you apply for an NSF grant, National Science Foundation grant, NHI grant, a lot of grants out there, even in the nonprofit sector, they want the deliverables measured in like how many people you meet, even here at Extension, like how many people you're serving, what's the impact of this, what's the logic behind this, all that stuff. They don't even think about what is the community's evaluation. If we're going to be in a community, we got to ask them how they view success. It's a little bit different. It's not so much about numbers, but it's about wellness, connection to community, connection to Zuni culture, sense of belonging, level of enjoyment, confidence in practicing healthy traditions. This is a fantastic way to really look at impact rather than just numbers, because you're putting a smile and you're putting that little child behind this in order to look at success. The success really is determined by the community. Here at the University of Arizona and the Indigenous Resilience Center, we're trying to make sure that success is defined properly. Another thing that I like to look at is, why is it like this? The redid definition of what I call societal norms. The indigenous value system is a lot different than the capitalist value system in the fact that it was once and still is for the most part dependent upon survival. If you look at the windbreaks, this is an example of windbreaks, you'll see windbreaks on the left-hand side that I typically lay out at my fields at Hopi. And then you'll see the ones that are governing the cattle production right there and the commodity crop production down there. Those are windbreaks used for economic gain and economic opportunity. I'm by no reason a socialist or anything like that, but I would sure like to make sure that our community survives by using those things that are available and provided to us by nature so that we can learn from each other, that us and nature can learn from each other. So why does that matter? So it matters because, like I said, well, how do we frame the narrative? How do we differentiate the narrative? This is something that I came up with when I was in Italy at the Bellagio Center next to the Rockefeller Foundation. I was coming up with some cohorts of mine. So everything right now is dependent upon gross domestic product. So we have first or third world countries, low income countries, developing nations, global north and south. So when people you ask where you're from, they say, are you from a third world country? Are you from a developing nation? You know, that's because it's dependent upon the gross domestic product. So why not switch the narrative and say, well, no, I'm from a high biodiversity country. You know, we sit on 80% of biodiversity. Look at us that way, you know, because we're responsible for your gross domestic product now. Think about it that way. We're rising to the level of resiliency and not to the level of victimhood by changing the narrative. And a lot of my work is going to dibble-dabble that to change the narrative. Because when you change the narrative, you also develop the rights, you also get invited to the table, you also, a lot of abundance comes from this by changing the narrative, and we're able to do that now. And so, what am I talking about? I'm talking about recognition. The key thing is the recognition and this pathway to equity. You cannot have recognition and we cannot have equity without recognition. Vine Deloria Jr., a Native American Indigenous author, once said that during the Civil Rights Movement, Indigenous people weren't involved in it because we did not want to be equal. We wanted to have recognition first, and we're still struggling with that today. And so that's one of the reasons why we didn't participate in the Civil Rights Movement, because we're still striving for recognition, and it's not the kind of recognition that I often see myself as being put on a museum wall in a black and white picture wearing a loincloth and a feather and everything like that. That's not the kind of recognition I'm looking for. I'm looking at the kind of recognition that stands over here at Mesa Verde talking to the head of the park superintendent there, trying to figure out plans in the future and looking at some of their advice and being at the table. That's the kind of recognition that I'm looking at. So what I'm talking about, Indigenous Ingenuity, getting close to the end of this, I'm looking at some of the equipment that we've adapted. You know, we were given the low word cloud back in the 50s. That thing was responsible for causing a dust bowl in the 30s. And so we moved away from that. We came up with these different deep row planting mechanisms that allows us to plant almost the same way and allow us to produce just as much crops as we had before if we did it by hand. The only downfall of that is you don't get connected to the earth like we used to, but we're still doing this and we're still producing crops. I'm trying to get the University of Arizona to look seriously at these, to maybe patent some of this equipment, but they're kind of hesitant on that, don't know why, but hopefully we'll get us moving forward on some of this stuff. So this recognition of indigenous knowledge is kind of catching fire a little bit. Recently in 2021, I was part of this process. You know, the White House Office of Technology policy says that traditional knowledges is now a science. TEK is now a science in 2021. You know, and I'll talk about that. Before that, you know, I used to work for the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and we had over 200 techniques that were similar to the ones that NRCS has, but we could never get funding for them. Why? Because they were not scientifically validated. Doesn't make sense, even though we had 10,000 years of replication, and as a scientist, replication is very important. Despite 10,000 years of replication, they weren't validated. So that bugs me. But traditional ecological knowledge is another buzzword. I just like to say that's the things that my grandfather taught me, you know, because that is traditional ecological knowledge, things that my grandfather taught me because it was passed down generation after generation. So barriers, the barriers that still exist. First of all, land tenure insecurity is not only a problem here in the United States, it's throughout the globe. So unless you have a right to your land totally, it's very insecure. So for example, we have at least 6 different types of land classification, which makes jurisdiction almost impossible to get through. And so that creates a number of barriers. There's just a lack of natural resource data, which I'm trying to work on. This lack of financial capital is also a big thing. So upscaling, you know, everybody's talking about that. Upscaling for the benefits of what? You know, I was asking that, for the benefits of the corporate sponsors, for the benefits of the supply people. I like to look at upscaling, and I'm only going to do upscaling if it's going to benefit the community. That means bringing back those seeds, bringing back those vital nutrients so that the community can benefit that them, not only will they be healthy, but they can also continue some of their traditional practices and cultural beliefs. So community-based solutions and collaborations, what am I looking at? Well, first of all, this continuance of environmental and cultural knowledge for the next generation. You know, I sure would like to use the Indigenous Correspondence Program to help educate Native youth to tell their own stories within their own community and talk about stories of resilience rather than victimhood. But this is really what this is about. This is about, you know, making sure that the next generation knows what's going on. They're still able to identify their own plants. They're still able to raise their own plants, and they're able to be happy. So revitalization of the American Indian food system, that's a project that I'm working on. I recently started a Fred Appleby Foundation, named after my grandfather. And what that's gonna do is gonna grow out Hopi seeds on Hopi. It's gonna create a Hopi storage facility where people can come up and pick up seeds. And it's also gonna teach Hopi youth how to do agricultural training within their own, using their own techniques. That's important. That's a lot of what's missing at Hopi. I think something like 17% now of Hopi people actually farm. And so I need to bring that back. That picture was my grandfather, my grandmother, and my father down there in the overalls. I should have worn my overalls today, but yeah, down there in the overalls, back taken probably about in the early 40s or so. And so it's just what I'm trying to start there on the Hopi reservation where I'm from, because to me it's really about giving back to the community. Native American Agricultural Fund I used to work for, this is a plan on how we can get from point A to point B. It contains infrastructure information, what we all would need as Indigenous people to make sure our systems are intact. That's another big thing that's coming out. This Northern Arizona water affordability study I've done recently, that's because of the problem at Hopi right now that we have. We're paying 4 or 5 times the cost of water right now because IHS with all their enlightenment didn't put any operational costs in. And that's just one of the reasons why we're paying a standard water bill of $35 now up to $150 or so. And so I'm trying to find ways to help find supplemental funding to get that thing going so that we're not so dependent upon just a cash-strapped economy. And so some of the stuff that I'm working on right now at the University of Arizona, I'm developing a process to make sure Indigenous communities can benefit research related to their seeds. I have something in the hopper, trying to get the University of Arizona to adapt that, to basically put those seeds under the same thorough look at as human subjects in our institutional review board process. I've got an article coming out with Rebecca Sosi, hopefully in the UCLA Law Review, looking at seed as intellectual property. That's a big one. First time I've been part of Law Review, we're up to 77 pages, 400 citations, and something like that. That's incredible. But you know, growing out seeds for the benefits of Indigenous community, increasing their scale, nutritional analysis of traditional foods for human well-being and getting them back into schools, and mitigating risk to tribes. I've got a project right now that I'm looking at just the water conservation techniques. So because I want to do the technology here first, I want to make sure it works, because I don't want it to just be sitting on Indigenous territory or tribal lands and nobody be able to use it for it because they can't operate it and it costs too much. So I want the University of Arizona to help share some of that responsibility. And so with that, you know, one last question here, we always have to ask ourselves, and this is what it's about for me, is it about community or is it about economics? And for me, standing here in front of you today, it's really about community. Nothing more needs to be said on that. You know, I think community is the way to go. I'm a social being. I love the social environment. And so that's where I'm at when it comes to that. Community or economics, I'll just leave you with that same type of thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So we do have some questions that are coming through in the chat.
Okay.
And I'm trying to get my chat back so that I can read those out loud. So when you were showing that picture of the maize growing on your property, David Perez wrote, "Those crops are thriving in that picture. It's amazing." And then Brenda Waddell asked, "Is there a place where these types of seeds are available already? I know of one company that is in exchange for heritage / non-GMO crop seeds for gardeners."
Yeah, to answer that question real quick, there are seed companies out there, Native Seed Search and other seed companies that do have indigenous seeds. And my hat's off to them for at least keeping those things propagated. But it depends on where you're going to grow them. But for example, when we take seeds that came from Native Seed Search back to Hopi, they don't grow well because they're not been propagated right. They use too much water. They don't know how to manage those things right, and that's one of my fearful things. But their indigenous seeds are out there. Once they're put on the public domain, they're very hard to keep back in tribal control. And so I'm just trying to figure out ways to get the original data, original genetic material from museums and things like that to make a claim that that's where that data came from. And that will be able to make a claim on that so that we can make sure that any benefits that have been derived over the years will also go back to those indigenous communities where they came from.
Opening up for other questions. I do have a question.
Yeah.
How are you balancing the need for data sovereignty and kind of that intellectual property piece around the seeds themselves and the genetic diversity of the seeds, and the need to share those so that there's some knowledge and capacity to grow and feed people?
Well, I think, one of the, it's very hard because like I said, agricultural products are a little bit different than, like you said, clay pipe or basket, because those can be usually traced specifically to community, where agricultural products are transboundary, they usually travel, there are things like that. But the whole data concept, to me, should be focusing on the territorial aspects of the indigenous agricultural products. Because it's hard to make a claim without leaving somebody out. For example, the Pueblo tribes, we all have maize, and I guarantee at one time we were all growing it together. And so all the people should benefit from that. All the Pueblo communities should benefit that in the territorial state of passion. But it's just hard to get, some of that indigenous data in the catalog like that and things like that. But first of all, we have to make a claim that where this came from, and what we have to use the genetic traceability to do that. In that book, Hopi Footprints, there was a DNA analysis in there to show exactly where those corn came from, and they did come from down south. And so that was kind of like the pathway of where Hopi come from to some aspect. And so it's kind of making that link. But the bigger link would be, well, what came out of that? The maize industry here in the United States is over $3 billion industry, but how much of that money has been gone back to indigenous people, where it's taking them over 10,000 years to develop a domestic corn plant? Where's their benefit come from? It had none that I know of. In fact, when we went out to Bayer, the indigenous correspondence people went out to Bayer, they asked them where they got the genetic material for the short corn variety, and they couldn't answer. They didn't know, or they wouldn't tell. So it's kind of like, they'll let you in the door, but they won't give you the information you need in order to make a wise decision. So, yeah.
That's that economic piece
Yeah.
versus community.
Yeah,
benefit.
exactly.
They're protecting their
Yeah.
commodity.
Yeah, exactly.
Other questions from folks online? Let's see. Brenda wrote, thanks for the information. They list corn seeds attributed to native cultures, and I was wondering if the tribes were a part of that, or if it was more of what has been said, but not a part of the tribes themselves.
Well, a lot of tribes unfortunately don't have codes on their books. They don't have an agricultural code. The Indigenous Food and Knowledge organization from University of Arkansas, I forgot their name, but they do have a tribal agricultural code. In that code, I believe it's chapter 2, would show them how to set up an intellectual property right. And that's important, because unless you have codes on your books, the law is not very favorable to you. And so we need to have a code in the agricultural sector. That's some of the work that I want to do down here, is look at tribes and see if they would consider adapting an agricultural code so they can protect themselves from any further exploitation.
So much work to be done.
There's a lot of work to be done.
So many.
And I think I want to kind of want to, talk about that too. A lot of work that I do is very demanding, it's very time consuming, and it's very important for me to remain focused. And that's the way I do it, is by looking at my community first, more so than I do myself as an individual. And so, we'll talk about the pathways that I've chosen. A lot of younger generations, even the college students that I talked here, they're so concerned about, making money. And so they go into these fields and they lose the fundamental value of why they're here. And I've got a new initiative that I'm starting to run through the mayor's office called One Child, One Seed. And so I'm looking at finding seeds. I'm not looking at what type, where they came from, but I want every child in Tucson to have the opportunity to plant something their first day of class. I grew up saying the Pledge of Allegiance my first day of class. So why not have one seed, one child, one seed? And so I'm making a pathway to do that with the help of Cooperative Extension and the other communities that are here in Tucson to do that.
Let us know how we can get.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure you will. You'll have to carry some soil for me.
All right. All right. Dr. Chiefs asks, when you were young, was there a moment When you were young, was there a moment when you decided to enter the field you are in? Did you know you wanted to get a graduate degree and be a professor?
I didn't really know I wanted to get a graduate degree until I spent a lot of time at Cornell University. I happened to go there after I was a music major, and I dropped out of music, and I quit school altogether. And I got there and I got to see the business-like aspects of agriculture, and I said, okay, well, I should go to graduate school. So then I went to graduate school at Pepperdine and got a public policy degree. Then I worked for the federal government for 2 years, and that's where I kind of said, hey, look, I would write the memos, I write the Natural Resource Conservation Service memos and say, this stuff isn't working, we need to do this, and they would just basically ignore it. And so all the conservation contracts we had out there, which was the Environmental Quality Incentive Program at the time, I think we had over 1.7 million, 1.5, we wound up giving those back. Because they weren't paying attention to how those things were signed, and so it was at that point that I said, I need to go back to graduate school and get my Ph.D. because I want to be at the table. And I would never thought I would have got a Ph.D. I was happy out there using my planting stick and planting corn and things like that. But now I'm at the table, probably more than I probably should be. But that's one of the main reasons why I went back, is because I want to be at the table to make sure that people benefit from what's out there, and also be an example. I think that's the best thing. Trying to be an example for Native youth to say they can do that too. I'm very happy when I see boards, especially boards like at the Intertribal Agricultural Council, where they do have youth membership on the board. Because I think sometimes we forget to do that. We forget to involve our youth on some of these things, and they have a total different viewpoint rather than us adults who are just tend to sit there in a rocking chair. At least I'm heading that direction someday. I want to make sure that I support as much as I can.
Thank you. There's another question.
Okay.
From Carmen Melendrez. Michael, I love your work. My question is, NSF is releasing a number of funding opportunities focused on projects that accelerate the transition to practice of foundational research and emerging technologies into communities through civic engaged, community-based, use-inspired research. But their focus is economic development. What would you propose for such a program that is community versus economic focused?
Well, there's been some pushback, by the indigenous community. Like all these environmental justice grants have been going to the institutions. They've been getting served by the institutions, and they're not going back to the people who are doing the real work on the ground, which are native-led grassroots organizations. And so, what I would suggest to NSFF and even USDA would be support those organizations. I understand the importance of having a government-to-government relationship, but we also need to have one with the government-to-people relationship. I mean, USDA back under Abraham Lincoln was the people's department. Where has it gone? It's more like the corporate's department. And so we need to figure out ways to tailor that back. And with that said, though, I think the whole process of economic development needs to go hand in hand with each other. I mean, I'm happy to be working with Gila River now on a call pretty soon, where we're going to try to combine both economic development, health, and agriculture under one umbrella. And so I'm using the opportunity that I have to see how that works, developing another model. So that's important, because I think at the end of the day, people like to make money. But for example, at Ramona Farms, they raise a lot of temporary beans, but they have to subsidize those temporary beans with their commodity crops, or their cotton and alfalfa, which are using way too much water. And it should be the other way around. The government should be subsidizing these specialty crops that are not only health value, but cultural value to these communities, to make sure that they're still where they need to be 300 years from now.
We do have to wrap up in like 5 minutes, folks. From Shannon Taylor, what are your thoughts on Bayer's short stature corn? I went to tour Bayer and saw the technology and how much they were changing the genomes to create short stature corn that is naturally produced on indigenous lands.
Well, my thing is where they get that genetic material from. All the stuff that's in that short Bayer corn is supposed to help with speed up the growing process, but it also helps with lodging, other things that indigenous people have been known about for a long time. They're just the benefits of that because they patent that. Where they got that gene from, I really would like to know, because and what right did they have to take that gene? I don't know. It's there. When I was at Cornell, they had a corn zoo. They could determine like what height the corn could come out, how many leaves were on the stalk, how big the stalk was, how thick the leaves were, how wide the leaves were, just by genetic variability, just by genetically changing things around. And so that in itself is kind of a dangerous thing to play with. But I just kind of, that's how my answer to that would be, where do they get that gene from, and what are they willing to support, where those original genes came from? And that's my main thing. Whether all they do is support the indigenous ingenuity that's already existed before they were invented. So I have to ask myself that question.
Yeah, so there's that kind of moral element.
It's a moral ethical thing. I mean, if we're gonna talk about environmental or equity justice here, we need to focus on that too, not just the monetary values of things. So, yeah.
We have a question from Ray Granillo in the Arizona Institutes for Resilience. Have you considered incorporating more technology in some of your initiatives, whether remote sensing or other types of data you'd like to gather?
Oh, yeah, I mean, let's look at the new nature assessment that's coming up, the natural nature assessment. Wouldn't it be fun to have a big photo snap of Indian country, of the 55 million acres that we have here? We don't have to go tribe by tribe, but we can show those key biodiversity areas, which I would call them, to show that we're managing our lands pretty good. Compared to the rest of the United States. I think that would be the main thing. Remote sensing can be a beautiful tool to do that, but we need to make sure that we have authors on that natural nature assessment in order to be guide them in the right direction. I think that's the most important thing. And by doing that, they're also helping with the tribe self-determination and how they're managing their own lands. So, yeah.
That's cool. All right, I have another question, since there's nothing else in the chat. So TEK is now science.
Mhm.
How are you helping and your colleagues helping move along the kind of shared, passed down from generation to generation research around crop development and with thriving crops on Hopi? How are you moving that along so that it qualifies as research so that you can attach more federal funding to your efforts?
Well, I think I'm framing it in what I would call looking at crops, indigenous crops, through the lens of conservation and biodiversity. I don't want to look at it as through race, because that doesn't fly well. I want to look at it through conservation and biodiversity and the importance of why we should continue to grow these crops, because of the genetic material that's abundant in these specific varieties. And so that's how I frame it as. And I think that's something that needs to be talked about more. And I'm glad to see that, the State Department's liaison there was talking about the importance of biodiversity too, and switching over some of those crops, because, the people in Africa weren't eating corn way back in the day. They were eating other things like millet and everything else that was actually grown in some fashions that we do. Some of their techniques were kind of like ours, where they have wide spacing, wide rows, but they've forgotten that because they were either forced to move off their land, or they were, some company came in there and wanted to grow something else, justifiable saying that we need to feed 1 billion people, or people are starving here. But we're making more people starve, and honestly, we're taking away that land that those crops must thrive on to grow something that shouldn't, in my mind, be there in the first place. That's all I'll say with that.
Okay, thank you. Bernice, would you like to wrap us up, please? We're at the hour, or we're at 12:50, which is the end of our.
So we'd just like to thank you, Dr. Johnson, for your session and taking time out of your busy schedule to provide us with this great presentation. And we'd also like to thank the Indigenous Resilience Center, UA Sloan Partnership, and the Water Resources Research Center, and the Office of Societal Impact. We'd like to also let everybody online know that our next session for the speaker series is scheduled for Tuesday, March 12th, and we will feature Dr. Denise Martinez, who will speak on place-based learning and cultural fire practices in California. And we will also have that in our chat. Cara, thank you for putting that in the chat for the next session.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Absolutely.